3 Sherpas stood on the slope and watched Derek Calera sit down in the snow at 27,800 feet. They called his name. He did not move. And then, one by one, they turned and walked away. What kind of man pushes the people trying to save his life so far past their breaking point that they leave him there to die? Base camp radio logs from the Summit Vantage Expeditions team recorded Derek Calera's final transmission at 7:12 p.m. on May 14th. It was not a distress call. It was not a cry for help. It was an argument. His lead Sherpa, Nima Chering, had just told him they needed to descend immediately. The winds were picking up. The sky to the northwest had turned a shade of purple that veteran guides in the Khumbu region know to fear. Derek's response, captured clearly on the recording and later reviewed by investigators, was calm and steady. And he told Nima that he had paid $68,000 for this summit and that no one was going anywhere. Nima said nothing for a long moment. Then he said quietly that he was leaving. 2 other Sherpas followed him down. Derek Calera stayed alone. At 27,800 feet in the dark, to understand how a man ends up there, how a successful, intelligent, physically fit human being ends up sitting in the snow at the edge of the death zone, while the people trained to keep him alive walk away. You have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to base camp and to the man Derek was, before the mountain showed him who he really was. Derek Calera was 44 years old and ran a mid-sized hedge fund out of Chicago's West Loop. He was not a reckless man by any conventional measure. He had a personal trainer, he meal prepped on Sundays, and he had completed a guided ascent of Kilimanjaro in 2019 and summited Island Peak in Nepal the following year. And those 2 experiences had done something to his sense of himself that the people closest to him had noticed and quietly worried about. His wife later told a journalist that he came back from Island Peak different, quieter in some ways, louder in others. He started talking about Everest within a week of landing back in Chicago. By the following spring, he had signed a contract with Summit Vantage Expeditions, a Kathmandu-based guiding company that advertised itself as offering a full-service South Col route experience for serious amateur climbers. The permit alone cost $11,000. The full package, including oxygen, Sherpa support, gear rental, and logistics, came to $68,000. Derek paid in full without negotiating. He arrived at Everest Base Camp on April 6th, earlier than most commercial clients that season. The glacier felt alive beneath the tent platforms, groaning and shifting in the cold night air. The smell at base camp is something no one quite prepares you for. It is glacier ice and stove fuel and unwashed bodies and the faint chemical sweetness of supplemental oxygen, mixing with the thin, dry air that sits at 17,600 feet. Prayer flags snapped and cracked in the wind above the puja altar, where the climbing team had gathered to receive blessings before their first rotation. Derek filmed all of it. He had a GoPro mounted to his helmet and a second camera he carried in his pack, and a habit of framing shots during moments when the other climbers were focused on the terrain. Nima Chering noticed this on the very first day. Nima had been guiding the South Col route for 11 years. He had summited Everest 9 times. He was 37 years old and said very little, which some clients mistook for shyness, and which was actually economy. He did not waste words. He sized Derek up during the approach to base camp and said later, during his debrief with investigators, that he had concerns from the start. Well, he was fit, Nima told them. Strong legs, good lungs for a man his age, but he was always watching himself, always thinking about how it looked. That is not a good sign up high. The first acclimatization rotation went smoothly enough. Derek climbed to Camp 1 at 19,900 feet and back down without incident. And he was short of breath on the ladders crossing the crevasse fields of the Khumbu icefall, but he did not panic, and Nima noted in his log that the client was performing adequately. The second rotation to Camp 2 at 21,300 feet went less well. Derek pushed the pace on the ascent, pulling ahead of the group on the western Sedibem, despite repeated requests from the assistant guide to stay together. At Camp 2 that night, he complained of a headache. He described as mild, took 2 ibuprofen, and posted footage to his social media accounts. The caption read, 21,000 feet and feeling strong. The comments filled with congratulations. He read them all before sleeping. A fellow client on the expedition, a software engineer from Vancouver named Rob Gillies, shared a tent with Derek at Camp 2 during that rotation. He recalled later that Derek talked about the summit constantly. It was all he wanted to discuss, Rob said. Not the route, not the conditions, just the summit. He wanted to know what it felt like, whether the photos were worth it. He kept saying he needed the footage to be perfect. Rob said he tried to bring up the acclimatization schedule, the importance of not rushing. Derek smiled and changed the subject. On May 9th, Nima called the team together at base camp to review the summit push. A weather window had opened. Forecasters were projecting a 3-day period of reduced winds beginning on May 13th, with conditions deteriorating again by the evening of the 14th. Nima laid it out plainly. They would leave Camp 4, the South Col, at 26,000 feet, no later than 11 p.m. on the 13th. They would observe a hard turnaround time of 2 p.m. on the 14th, regardless of position on the mountain. Anyone who had not reached the summit by 2 p.m. would descend immediately. No exceptions. Derek raised his hand and asked what happened if someone was close to the summit at 2 p.m. Nima looked at him for a moment. "You descend," he said. Derek nodded slowly in a way that Nima would later describe as a man agreeing to a rule he has already decided does not apply to him. The team reached Camp 4 on the evening of May 13th after a brutal push through the Geneva Spur. The South Col at night is one of the most hostile places on Earth. The wind comes across the plateau in waves that hit like a physical force, and the temperature that evening sat at negative 38 degrees Celsius. The tent shook so hard the poles bent. Derek lay in his sleeping bag and could not sleep. He could hear the wind screaming outside, and he could feel his own heartbeat loud and strange in his chest, which is what altitude does to a body when it is running on bottled oxygen and the edge of its own endurance. He checked his camera batteries. He checked his footage from the climb up. He posted nothing because there was no signal, but he composed the caption in his head. He was happy with it. Nima came to the tent at 10:45 p.m. He had just received a weather update from base camp. The deterioration window had moved forward by several hours. The winds were expected to pick up by 4 p.m. the next day instead of evening. He told Derek and Rob that the turnaround time was now 1 p.m. Derek looked at the ceiling of the tent. He said that was fine. Rob said that was fine. Monema believed one of them. They left the South Col at 11:10 p.m. and began the long climb toward the balcony at 27,500 feet. The fixed lines were in place. The stars above the summit pyramid were extraordinarily bright. Derek climbed steadily for the first 2 hours, keeping pace with the group, and for a while it seemed like Nima's concerns had been misplaced. Then, somewhere between the balcony and the south summit, Derek unclipped his ascender from the fixed line and stepped to the left of the route to film the sunrise breaking over Lhotse. It took Nima several minutes to notice. When he turned back and saw Derek standing off route with the camera raised, his stomach dropped. He had seen this before. Not always on Everest, but he had seen it. He shouted. The wind took his voice and shook it apart. He climbed back down toward Derek and grabbed his arm and pointed at the fixed line, and said the word now very clearly and very loudly, directly into Derek's face. Derek nodded and clipped back in. He was smiling. He said the shot was incredible. Nima said nothing. He turned and led them higher, and the sky continued to brighten, and the mountains said nothing either, the way mountains do, patient and entirely indifferent, waiting for the moment when patience would no longer be necessary. The wind hit them properly at 10:23 a.m., just below the south summit at 28,700 feet. It did not build gradually. It arrived. One moment, the air was cold and still, and the next, it was a wall of force that knocked Rob Gillies sideways into the fixed line and tore Derek's buff from around his neck and sent it spinning into the void above the Kangshung face. And Derek grabbed the rope. He looked up at the sky and saw the purple-gray mass rolling in from the northwest and understood, for the first time and too late, that Nima had not been overcautious. Nima had been right. And they were still 400 vertical meters below the summit, with the weather closing and the turnaround time approaching. And Derek Calera standing on the side of the highest mountain on Earth, realizing that the gap between who he thought he was and who he actually was had just become very, very clear. The wind at 28,700 feet does not push. It presses. It finds every gap in your clothing and pulls heat from your body the way water pulls heat from a swimmer. Derek Calloway felt it in his fingers within the first 60 seconds. He was wearing expedition weight mittens over liner gloves, and the cold cut through both layers like they were nothing. He gripped the fixed line and pressed against the slope and told himself it was a gust. He told himself it would pass. It did not pass. Nama was 6 meters above him, already clipping his descender to the line, already turning to go down. Rob Gillies was just below Derek, goggles fogged, pressed flat against the ice. Rob said later, the sound was like standing inside a jet engine. He started moving the moment Nima signaled. He assumed Derek would follow. Derek unclipped from the fixed line. He moved left toward a rock feature for a windbreak and raised his second camera toward the summit pyramid, still visible through the gray above. The wind shook the lens. The image was barely usable. He filmed for 90 seconds. And then he tried to clip back in and discovered the rope had moved. The wind had swung it 5 meters to his right, pressed against the slope across a 45-degree sheet of wind-scoured ice with no reliable crampon placements and nothing to stop a fall. Nima saw it from below. He considered going back up. He assessed the slope, calculated the conditions, and decided an unroped ascent across that section would likely put 2 people in trouble instead of 1. He radioed base camp at 10:31 a.m. and reported a client off the fixed line. Then he continued down with Rob. That decision would become the central question of the investigation. Derek tried to sidestep toward the rope. On the third step, his crampon caught a wind slab and he went down hard on his hip and clawed at the ice and stopped himself 18 inches from the drop, where he radioed base camp at 10:44 a.m. His voice was thin but controlled. He said he was off the line near the south summit and could not get back to it. Base camp told him to stay still and conserve heat. At 28,700 feet in 50-mile-per-hour wind at -42 Celsius, conserving heat is not a strategy. It is a delay. His radio batteries died at 11:17 a.m. He put the radio inside his suit and pressed tighter against the ice. The HACE that had been building since the previous night took over quietly. Colors shifted. Distances became hard to judge. He looked at the fixed line 5 meters away and could not assemble the steps needed to reach it safely. He stood up, sat down, stood up again. The shivering stopped around noon. His body had moved from fighting the cold to surrendering to it. He told a rescue team member later that he felt calm, that the wind seemed quieter, that he thought about his daughter, that he almost fell asleep. By 1 p.m., the wind was gusting to 70 miles per hour. 3 helicopter attempts had been turned back. Base camp was running out of options, and Derek's GoPro kept recording, pointing at the sky, capturing nothing but cloud and gray and snow driving sideways through the frame, until at 1:58 p.m., the camera tilted slowly downward, and a hand moved across the frame, and then there was only the sound of the wind. Jangbu Sherpa reached Derek Calloway at 2:41 p.m. after 90 minutes of climbing across terrain the Himalayan Rescue Association later classified as extremely high risk. He found Derek 40 meters left of the south summit fixed line, sitting against a small ice formation with his knees drawn up and his goggles around his neck. His eyes were open. Jangbu called his name. Derek did not respond. Jangbu shook his shoulder and called again. Derek's head turned slowly, his eyes finding Jangbu's face the way a person surfaces from deep water. He said something too quiet to hear over the wind. Jangbu leaned in close and heard him say he was sorry. Jangbu told investigators later, his hands folded tight in his lap. His lips were blue and his skin was the color of old paper. I told him help was here. I do not know if he heard me. Sonam Wangchuk arrived 4 minutes later. The two men worked fast. Sonam fitted the emergency oxygen mask and opened the valve. Jangbu checked Derek's pulse. It was there, faint and wrong, the rhythm of a heart working far too hard. On the field thermometer read 28.4 degrees Celsius. Below 30 degrees, the heart becomes electrically unstable. They were already past that line. They wrapped him in the emergency sleeping bag and pressed chemical heat packs to his armpits, groin, and neck. Base camp medic relayed instructions clearly. Do not walk him down. Moving a hypothermic patient too roughly can trigger cardiac arrest. Jangbu looked at the sky. It was the color of iron. Captain Rajan Shrestha had been watching the weather from Lukla for 2 hours. At 3:15 p.m., a narrow window opened. He launched without hesitation. His co-pilot said later, he knew how small that window was. He also knew there was a man alive up there. Those two things made the decision for him. The helicopter reached the south summit area at 3:44 p.m. Din Shrestha found a possible landing zone 60 meters below the rescue party and brought the aircraft to 15 meters above the surface. Jangbu and Sonam got Derek upright between them and began moving him toward the extraction point. The gust hit at 3:51 p.m. 43 miles per hour from the northwest, striking the helicopter broadside. Shrestha held it, but the landing zone disappeared in driven snow. He made one more pass and aborted. He radioed Jangbu. Jangbu looked at Derek. His eyes were closed. His head had dropped forward. His breathing was slow and wet, and Jangbu recognized the sound and did not say what it meant. Getting Derek to the fixed line took 22 minutes. Sonam carried most of his weight across a 40-meter traverse. Both men would later call the hardest thing they had ever done on a mountain. Jangbu rigged a descent harness from a spare sling and 2 carabiners and tested it twice. They moved down in short sections, anchor to anchor, until they reached Camp 4 at 5:22 p.m. At 6:10 p.m., base camp received the update. Derek was alive. Pulse 52. Temperature 29.1 degrees. Marginally better. The medic paused before he spoke again. He said the next 12 hours would determine everything. Derek Calloway died at 4:17 a.m. on May 15th at Camp 2, 21,300 feet. His heart went into ventricular fibrillation at 4:09 a.m. The medic worked on him for 8 minutes. Then she stopped, sat back on her heels, and picked up the radio. Nima Charing was awake in a nearby tent. He heard the tone of the transmission before he heard the words. He said later that he already knew. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as severe hypothermia, now with contributing factors of high-altitude cerebral edema and frostbite across all fingers and toes. He had been exposed on the open slope for 4 hours before rescue teams reached him. His body fought for 8 more hours after that. It was a fight nothing could win at that elevation, in those conditions, starting that far behind. The Nepal Mountaineering Association completed its incident review 6 weeks later and classified the death as a preventable fatality resulting from deviation from established safety protocols and inadequate client management. That last phrase was diplomatic. What investigators actually found made them angry. Summit Vantage Expeditions was licensed to operate at a minimum Sherpa to client ratio of 1 to 2 on summit day. The actual ratio on May 14th was 1 to 4. Nima was the sole certified high-altitude guide for all 4 clients. 2 turned back at the balcony. Rob descended with Nima. Derek was functionally alone above the south summit because the one guide responsible for him was also responsible for 3 other people. The company had cut its Sherpa staffing by 30% that season to offset permit costs. This did not appear in any client materials. It appeared in an internal operations log that investigators subpoenaed. A company director signed off on it in February. 3 months before the expedition left Kathmandu. Someone made that decision at a desk to save money. Derek Calloway died on a slope above the south summit, and part of that death belongs to that decision. The case was added to the Himalayan database, bringing Everest's confirmed death toll to 324 since 1953. East Summit Vantage had its license suspended for 1 season and was required to implement a mandatory 1-to-2 guide ratio going forward. The changes were real. They came too late. Everest has taken over 300 lives. 1 in every 60 climbers who attempts the summit dies. 90% of those deaths happen on the descent. The mountain does not care about your training or your footage or the caption you wrote in your head at Camp 4. Rescuers recovered Derek's GoPro 6 days after his death. The last clip was the 90 seconds of shaking, wind-blurred video he shot while the fixed line swung away from him. The summit is visible in the background. It looks close enough to touch. Why did the Sherpas leave Derek Calloway on that slope? Because they had families. Because the window to get everyone else down was measured in minutes. But also because Derek had been leaving them the whole time. Every unclipped section, every ignored warning, every smile, he left them first. He just did not know it. The mountain did.